Hello, good morning. Well, I will speak in English today. Thank you for joining us for this conference. We have streaming of the conference. Now we are in the channel YouTube of SEMA, and then you can reach this anytime you like. Today at the University of SEMA, we have the privilege and the pleasure to receive the visit of Professor Hugo Sonnenschein. Hugo is President Emeritus and Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago, where he teaches an undergraduate course in game theory and a graduate course in microeconomic theory. Professor Sonnenschein served as president of the university from 1993 to 2000. He's laureate of the 2009 BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award with Andrew Mascolel for Economics, Finance, and Management. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association. He has served as president of the Econometric Society and has received an honorary doctoral degree from 7 colleges and universities, including Keio University, Tel Aviv University, and the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. I don't want to take any more time, so I just thank you once again, Hugo, for this conference on an introduction to bargaining and a new theory of negotiation. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming at this time. We know that it is not the best time you are working at this time, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All yours. Thank you.
So I'll try and finish and get you back to your offices or for your meals. Hola, ¿qué tal? That's the end of my Spanish speaking for today. Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Good. The title is descriptive. I'm going to give a very introductory account to game theory, to bargaining theory. I'm going to talk about a new theory of negotiation, give an introduction to that. And tomorrow there'll be a talk by my colleague and co-author, Christos Tombasos, who's here. And for those of you who want to get deeper into the weeds, that talk will follow this one and be more of a professional seminar. This talk is more of a introductory account and an opportunity to speak about game theory to an audience where some of the people are experts. Who's an expert? Nobody ever puts their hand up. Who's not an expert? Okay, so that gives me an idea of the audience, but I know that there really are some people here who are quite expert in game theory, and this really isn't a talk for them, although parts of it, I just hit something, and that will probably go away after a while, but if I need help, I'll get help. Okay, this is a mouse. Where's my, this is what I really need. I'll put the mouse away. Okay, so I think this will work.
Maybe we need help from system.
Okay, we're not,
This guy here. So let's close that one first, and then, yeah,
okay.
these 2 arrows.
So it'll work now, okay. Okay, so a good introduction are the following words of Adam Smith. And economists like to quote this, and perhaps they quote it too much. The idea is that people doing the best for themselves will promote the social good more effectively than if they really intended to promote it. And that's a famous line, and one that's repeated quite often. On the other hand, there's also a classical image of hell. And the classical image of hell, which preceded this and is in a sense more intuitive, easier to understand, has a collection of people sitting around a table. And the table is just full of food, a magnificent amount of food, and more than enough to feed all of the people. And each one of the people has a fork. And the forks are rather long. And if they go and they stab the food that they want and they try and feed themselves, then it goes by their ear. And they can't feed themselves and they starve. On the other hand, if they'll go into the food and they'll pass it to the person across the way, and the person across the way will feed them as well, then the outcome is very good. But it's a story where there's an ample amount of food, and yet people do very poorly. So people doing the best for themselves doesn't promote the social good. And that, in a sense, is more intuitive. We like to think of a society where people thinking about others, caring for them, and doing good things for them will lead to a good society. And a society where people are selfish will lead to a less good society. On the other hand, there's this line of Adam Smith, and it's a line that we support quite strongly in our courses in microeconomics, where we talk about the efficiency of competitive markets. But it's really less intuitive than the classical image of hell, and that's why Adam Smith was a great man. You know, he also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So he was a philosopher. He had a very broad range, and it's not only lines like the first one that he's responsible for. So the next part of what I have here is, do we have too much or too little government? So I'll take a vote. Who thinks we have too much government? Who thinks too little? Aha. Okay. But often there are divisions, and you'll get different answers if you ask different audiences. The next one is easy. Do we have a good enough government? Everybody answers no. You know, almost anywhere you get that answer. And the big question is, how should we organize society, and in particular, the economic interactions to promote the social good? Now, I'm going to be talking about that at a very abstract way, not at a very advanced level. This is really a very introductory talk, and won't assume that you know a lot of economics. But that's the big question. Duflo and Banerjee, friends of mine, young people by my account, just shared the Nobel Prize, and you all know that. And they wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, which I recommend to you. And this is taking the side of the classical image of hell. And it's to be taken quite seriously. And the title is descriptive. They say economic incentives don't always do what we want them to do, okay? And I think everybody will agree that to some extent economic incentives won't cure everything. But again, the big question is, how do you organize society? What kind of government? What do you expect your government to do? So let's see whether I'm becoming a master of this. Good. So game theory, in a primitive way, provides some stories. I want to emphasize the stories. A lot of what game theory provides is not, careful plans of action. It provides more fables, I would say. Fables like the gift of the Magi. Can you understand me? Am I speaking in ways I might speak more? It's okay? Okay, very good. So stories are part of what game theory does. And a little bit about tools and a framework to address some of these big questions. But we're not going to answer those big questions. And indeed, the answer to those questions depends a lot on the particular country you're in, the stability of institutions, let me call it the morality of institutions, a good court system, a press. So I don't think there are uniform answers. But we'll talk about some tools and a framework. And it's an introduction to game theory and mechanism design. And what I'm heading toward is bargaining and a theory of negotiation. Negotiations are very important, particularly in a democratic society, or a society that pretends it's democratic. And so you want to think about negotiations, have an idea of how effective they are in promoting the social good. So I'm going to introduce you to, the work of John Nash. I'm old and I'm very fortunate. So I taught at Princeton before Chicago. I was the provost. Part of the provost's job, the main job of the provost, is taking care of the faculty. And John Nash was a member of our community. And I knew John when he was particularly ill. My wife, Beth, who was here, would ride the train with him because he would go back and forth between Princeton and Princeton Junction. So a great man and a very, very ill man at part of his life. And if you haven't read A Beautiful Mind, it's a beautiful book, and you should read that. And maybe you've seen the movie. The book's better than the movie. The movie's good, too. Ariel Rubinstein, a very close friend who I'll have a meal with next month. A leading game theorist, Roger Myerson, who's a colleague. Satterthwaite, who's been a co-author. And there probably won't be time permitting, but also work of William Samuelson and Chatterjee is nice. And so they're friends and colleagues, and sharing their work is really an honor. The theory of negotiation that I'll head towards is more my research interest and work that I'm engaged in with, this is probably too small on the bottom, so Christos Tombazos, who will present tomorrow, and then Matthew Jackson. It's a small world. Jackson was my student at Princeton. King Tsing was his student at Stanford. Omar is a Bahraini who is a co-author of this and was a Chicago graduate. So what's the goal for today? Again, the audience has some people who have never seen anything about game theory. I'm sure there are some experts. But I'm going to really pitch this to people who are seeing game theory ideas, either for the first time or they haven't seen this for a while. And even though it begins in the most elementary way, I assure you that it'll push you, unless you're a real pro at this stuff, by the end. And if I'm successful, you'll take away some lessons that will help you think about the world. How you shop for your next car, loan negotiations with the IMF if you're in a position to be involved in that for your country, what you expect of your government. So those are the things that I want you to be able to think about a little bit better. So I'm going to tell you two stories. The first story is personal. One of the big responsibilities for a president of a major university in the United States, if it has a medical school, almost all major universities do. Princeton didn't, actually, and doesn't. But Chicago has a great medical school. And one of the first things that I had to do as a president of the university was hire a new dean. As I arrived, the current dean decided it was a good time to leave. I had to find a new dean. And hiring a dean of a medical school is a very, very complicated and important business. Our medical schools and hospitals attached to them are, $5 billion businesses typically, large numbers of people employed. People care about it. It's not only their health, it's their life. And so your medical school is a pretty defining part, for the good or for the bad, of our modern U.S. universities. And hiring a dean is a big obligation. So I went out to hire a dean, and I found a really fine candidate. The candidate seemed to like Chicago, and he was coming from Harvard, which was a decent school. He was the chairman of surgery, and And that's the typical profile of somebody you hire as your dean. And so I sit down to do a negotiation. And negotiations are complex. First of all, the typical salaries then, this is some years ago, of a dean of a major academic medical center is $1 million. It's more like $2 million. That's an average. And that's only the beginning of it. So you have to negotiate a salary. This person I was trying to hire was a woman, and the woman was married to a physicist, and the physicist was quite good, maybe not of the caliber that our physics department would go out and hire by itself. But I had this idea that the person I wanted to hire was kind of interested in a job for her husband. And then, you know, this person expects to have housing, you know, some nice home, well located near the center of the university area and the hospitals. And it's also the case that this person expects to be able to say, well, when I spoke to the president, I was able to get a dowry of $30 million or $60 million to spend on the faculty and take care of them, better laboratories, colleagues in important areas. So what you're negotiating is extraordinarily complicated. A salary much higher than my own, and a good deal of money involved. Not only money, but this candidate felt that she would be very good at raising money. Deans are expected to go out and shake the trees and have money come down. And for a medical school dean, you know, the idea is they put their hand on a person's shoulder and after a while learn about their family, learn about their children, their parents, and almost always there's a medical need. So your dean feels that if he's empowered to go out and go to anybody in the community and ask them for money for the medical school, then she's going to do really well. On the other hand, I also have a dean of the law school. And the dean of the law school is fiercely protective of his donors. And he doesn't want the dean of the medical school to be empowered to put his hand around anybody in the university community or the city. So, you know, what am I going to say in terms of those kinds of arrangements? And what is this person going to expect of me? So the point is, it's a very, very complex negotiation with many parts. And I don't know what she really cares about. She may feel that it's better for her husband to go to Northwestern in physics, and he may have a good offer from Northwestern. Okay. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what matters to her, how hard it is for me to give different parts of what she may want. There's another example here. If you have very good eyes, you may be able to read it or not, but it's a classic, important negotiation that happened in the mid-'80s, sort of started in the early '80s. IBM built computers, and computers around then were these humongous machines. They took up a room, big room, like this, and you had to keep the room cool. And there were punch cards. I mean, it was an entirely different day. And, you know, IBM was a very powerful company, and Fujitsu, Japanese company, was also entering the industry. The main part of this was developed by IBM. The operating system had been built by IBM originally. And Fujitsu was copying the operating system. And they were writing software. And they were tending to sort of write software which do the same thing as IBM. It's not so bad to have competition, The antitrust laws were not well written on this subject. And so IBM and Fujitsu were in a terrible, terrible fight about Fujitsu's ability to write programs that would do the kinds of things that people want. Again, that's competition, not a bad sort of thing. And they were at war. And eventually, over a period of time, this sort of settled out. One of the main people was the person who leads the negotiation project at Harvard. His name is Professor Mnookin. And over a period of time, this settlement was a $1 billion settlement. And that's even in old money. This is really a lot of money. And so negotiations are all over. It's a big part of what we do. And are negotiations productive? Or can they lead to, bad outcomes? I mean, that's part of the big agenda of how the invisible hand, works or might work. So this gives you an introduction. Now, if you really want to sit down and model the details of that, it's incredibly complicated. And there are many books that are written which give you guides to how one might negotiate, bargain, but there really aren't adequate general models, and there probably never could be an adequate general model. I'm going to talk about models that are games, and I'm going to start by talking about a real game with real money. For this, are there any undergraduates here? Master's students, I should say. Let's try master's students. Who's a master's student? Okay, I want you. And I want somebody not sitting near you who you don't know particularly well. Is there another master's student? Come on up, you come up. Any other master's student? I'm going to have to pick somebody. You get extra points for being here, I should tell you. So how about an early doctoral student or professional school student? I need one other person. It's going to be a good thing for you. Somebody volunteer. I'm going to pick you. May I pick you? Okay, good. Okay. So we're going to play a game, and the game works like this. I'm going to give each of you envelopes. And the reason that others of you might have volunteered for this is I have real money. I have $40 US. Okay, here we go. Okay. Now, it's going to work this way. I'm going to give each of you $10. Yes. And now we're going to play the following game. The game will work this way. You're not going to let the other person see, so you're going to turn your backs to each other in a moment when I say do that. And then you can put the $10 in the envelope, or you can put the $10 in your pocket. If you don't have a pocket, you can just crumple it and put it in your hand, okay? And you're going to then hand the envelopes to me. And I'm going to take the envelopes, and if I see that there's $10 in it, I'm going to add another $10. If I see that it's empty, I won't add anything. And then I'm going to reverse the envelopes. Okay? So you're going to wind up with the envelope that you're holding now. Okay? And you're going to wind up with the envelope that he's holding. But the amount of money that it has in it will depend on whether you put the $10 in your pocket or whether you put it in the envelope. So now turn your back to each other, and you can either put it in the envelope or you can hold it. And it's no right answer, whichever you want to do. Okay, now turn it around, okay? And now give me your envelopes. Okay, now let's keep our eyes on this. This is the envelope that you handed me. And the envelope has $10 in it, so I'm going to add $10. I'm going to give it to you, okay? And that's now your money, by the way, I should tell you. And the envelope that you gave me has $10 in it, and I'm going to add $10 and give that envelope to you. So I've gone broke, and they've each made $20. Now, I do this in different places. There's really no right answer to this. There is an answer that game theory predicts for this, but there's not a right answer, and I really don't want to claim that anything that you did was right or wrong. I do want us to observe that you're deciding whether to put $10 in the envelope or not. Let me pick on you for this story. And in deciding that, you might think about what the other person is doing. Now, if the other person is putting $10 in her envelope, then what would you want to do? Well, if you put it in your pocket, you do better than not putting it in your pocket, right? Because whether she's putting the money in the envelope or not, which will affect the amount that gets turned back to you, the amount you get will be higher if you put the money in your pocket, okay? Does this game look in any way familiar to you? Have you seen a game like this? So in fact, many of you have. Anybody want to shout out what game it looks like? Okay, so you're through, you've made money. That's the end of it for you. You can go sit down. It wasn't so hard. No, it's yours. It's yours.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Yes, yes. Yes, you're very welcome. They're very polite also, I should say. It's very nice. Okay, now why not? So let's in fact do a little more with this. This is in fact the way a game theorist would look like this, okay? Now, there's person one. Let's say person one is female, so we can have in our mind who is playing. And there's person two is male. And person one, who is female, can put money in the envelope. If the other person puts money in the envelope, then they'll both get $2. This is $20, okay? If person one puts money, so I should really explain, this is really a bit unfair. The first coordinate here is the payoff to the first person, in this case the woman. The second coordinate here is the payoff to the second person, in this case gendered male, okay? So if the female puts money in the envelope and the second person puts money in the pocket, then the payoff is right here. And it means the second person gets $30 and the first person gets $0. Okay? So now if you look at this carefully, you can ask the question whether it's better to put money in the envelope or the pocket. And what you'll see is no matter what the other person does, you're always better off putting money in your pocket, which is not what you did. And if you both put money in your pocket, then the outcome is that you both get $10. So what you did is not what the game theory would predict. This is what's called a prisoner's dilemma. I've done this 3 times in different places, and every time the outcome is the outcome we just got. Okay? And it's with people who don't know each other. You probably don't know each other very well, right? Okay. So, and you didn't think I was going to then say, let's do it again, right? We were doing it once. And if you just look very carefully at whether it's to put money in the envelope or put money in the pocket, let's say that you're person one, envelope or pocket, and you ask yourself the question, well, I can look at the situation where the other person is doing envelope, I can look at the situation where the other person is doing pocket, I'm always better putting money in the pocket. Okay? So that's something to think about. This is the canonical, most important example of people doing the best for themselves doesn't necessarily promote the social good. Okay? In fact, something else may be going on. It could be that we're dealing with people who weren't just selfish, but were thinking about the benefit of the other person. Or, this really isn't so simple, you know. Take it home and think about it, okay? And it could be that cognitively, it's not the simplest thing to figure out what the best thing is for yourself in terms of maximizing the payoff. And I'm not, you know, I really was asking you to agree to be subjects here, and I'm not going to then, you know, push this further in terms of what made you do what you were doing. But it's a good thing for everybody who hasn't seen this before to take it home, think of exactly the experiment that I did, and then think of what it's best for you to do. Separate it out, the other person does pocket or does envelope, and notice that it's always better for you to put money in the pocket. Okay? And that's a prisoner's dilemma. So, any questions? Okay. So, yes, question.
There was some social pressure because we were watching.
No, of course.
And markets are not so transparent.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. You know, this is not better if I did this experiment and nobody was watching it, okay? We could ask whether that affected the behavior. Certainly the fact that people are watching does affect how people behave. And that may be one of the lessons. And if you want a behavioral theory, you should really think carefully about whether other people are watching. And that affects behavior a great deal. So thank you for the question. Not going to fight you on it. You know, it's also the case that implicitly they may have felt a kind of infinity for the other person, okay? You know, just want to be good to the other person, not only what other people think. Or they may have felt that, well, despite what I said, I might have invited them to play again. And if you're going to play this again, then maybe there's good reasons to believe that people will keep on putting money in the envelope and getting these big payoffs. And there are experiments which demonstrate that that's the fact. So, very good, thank you. All right, now, this now becomes much more advanced. Even if people knew the first story, it's unlikely, given my quick survey of this audience, that many of you have seen the second story. The second story is the following. Don't even bother looking at this for the moment. Let's suppose that I say, okay, we can see that both putting money in the envelope is very good in terms of total payoff. You wind up taking $40 from me, okay? Let's call that 4 instead of 40. And maybe we should write a contract. And maybe the contract is that while you're standing here, you call up an attorney, he writes some papers, and the papers say that you're bound to put the money in the envelope, okay, and get the good payoff. Get all of my $40 from me, okay? Now that really isn't what we were modeling. I wasn't allowing that. But, you know, let's try and think more broadly about this. Let's imagine that people can write this kind of contract. If they can write this kind of contract, the next thing that comes to their mind is, well, there's then going to be $4 generated, okay? And if $4 generated, how's it going to be split? Maybe the contract should specify we both have to write, we both have to play envelope, okay? And after we play envelope and get this payoff, then we know that you guys are going to walk out pretty rich with $4 or $40, depending on how we say this. And then, you know, you could say to your colleague, I'm only going to agree to that contract if I get $3 and you get $1. Or I get $2.50 and you get $1.50. And you may say back, no, 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 no. I get the $2.50, you get the $1.50. And if you don't agree to that, I won't agree to signing the contract, which says that I have to, on pain of a big forfeit, put money in the envelope. Okay? So that leads to the question of how would we bargain over the $4, which we know we can now get if we're bound to put the dollar that we receive into the envelope, both of us. Okay? And this is hard stuff now, and this is a theorem of Rubinstein. And Rubinstein looks at the game where the two of you look at each other and you say, okay, look, we understand that we could generate $4 by both agreeing to put the money in the envelope. Let's now bargain over how the $4 is to be divided. And you might say, I want $2.50 or I'm not going to sign this. And you might say, no, 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 I'm not going to do that. I want the $2.50. And so suppose we allow people to bargain that way and play that game. Okay? And it's modeled a little bit more simply. It's modeled so that first you offer, then you can counteroffer or accept. And if you don't accept, you can make this counteroffer and you can accept that counteroffer or not, in which case you can make a counteroffer, and we look at that game. That's actually a fairly complicated game. It's a game that's played over time. You have to understand subgame perfect equilibrium. Who's heard of subgame perfect equilibrium? Okay, so that's small numbers of people, but you have to model this sort of carefully. And it was a big deal theorem and proof of Rubinstein's that a remarkable thing would happen in this game. And the remarkable thing is that it settles immediately. And if the people are equally impatient, see, impatience matters because time goes on as you make these offers and counteroffers. And delta is a discount factor. I think given time and given what I'm sensing in terms of background, it's best to just not do too much with this, other than to say that the amazing result is an offer is made. If you're equally impatient or close to equally impatient, then the offer that's made says, let's split this just about equally. The person who offers first gets a little bit of an advantage. That's why I put 2 plus, might be $2.1, okay? And the other person accepts it immediately. The theorem is that all subgame perfect equilibria of that game have settlement immediately. Well, that's some points for the invisible hand, okay? If it would have taken a while to settle, okay, then both of you would lose value, okay? But it doesn't take a while to settle. This theorem, which is really quite remarkable, says that settlement happens immediately, and if they're equally impatient, it happens with this sort of equal division. Now, many people who look at this, and the two of you in particular might have thought, well, look, a lot of what I care about is what's fair. Okay, I have an intuitive notion of fair. And people who are looking on, apropos your point, might say, if the other person is not making fair offers, then they're bad people. Okay? But putting all of that aside and just looking at people doing what's best for themselves, this game will settle immediately if people are equally impatient at approximately equal division. And that's high-level game theory. That I would teach to very advanced undergraduates toward the end of a course. But we could do that at Chicago. Okay, now, I'm not going to run over because I know your time is valuable, and we're going to get into the home stretch. The home stretch considers situation which I mentioned when I was talking about my dean negotiation. And it looks something like this. Suppose I'm a seller, and as a seller, half the time I can be a seller who doesn't value what I'm selling at all, but half the time I could have a high valuation. I just want you to think about the situation that I'm describing. And I'm facing a buyer, and the buyer half the time can have a low valuation, 40, or can have a high valuation, 200. And these are drawn independently from each other. So in particular, and this is the way I talked about my dean story, if I'm a seller, I could be a seller who values the object very highly, but I don't know whether I'm facing a buyer who has a low valuation or a high valuation. If it's a low valuation, I'm not going to be able to make a deal. But if it's a high valuation, there's an opportunity maybe to trade at 180, okay? But my problem is I don't know that. And this takes you into another area of game theory. It takes you into what's called Bayesian games and situations where you know your valuations, but you don't know the other agent's valuations. So it's very different than the situation we just looked at that Rubinstein solved. And this uncertainty is really very basic to advances in game theory over the last 30, 40 years. And the work that I'm introducing sort of talks about worlds where there are negotiations, but you don't know the value of different parts of a deal to the other agent. So let's say it's an IMF kind of negotiation. And you don't know how the IMF is going to feel about different aspects of a deal that would be made. They'll set precedents for what will happen later, okay? And the IMF, on the other hand, doesn't know how badly you need this part of the negotiation versus another. This part may involve how you treat in terms of tax law a particular one of your commodities. And you may be willing to put that into the deal that you make with the IMF or not. So these are worlds, and the most important thing I want to do here is just describe this kind of world, okay? This is what, the world really looks like, so to speak. And so this kind of bargaining, which is not well developed, is part of what we look at. I think given time constraints, I don't want to go too much in this, but this describes a situation where, let's say it's the case where when a seller who doesn't value the object very much meets a buyer who doesn't value it very much, they sort of split the gain. It's a 0 and a 40. They split things at 20. When a 0 meets a 200, again, they split the possible gains. There shouldn't be trade here when a 160 meets a 40. Okay? And let's suppose that we have a situation where, in fact, no matter how people bargain, no matter how they approach this problem, half of the surplus is always realized. So when a 0 meets a 40, this is the way that the surplus is split. It's 50-50. When a 0 meets a 200, this is how the surplus is split. It's 50-50. Well, there's a real problem there, and that problem is part of the basis for my colleague winning a Nobel Prize, and this is the Meyerson-Satterthwaite theorem, because you can observe here that a person who has zero valuation might be tempted to say, look, you, the buyer, I don't really know whether you're this kind or this kind, but I will tell you that I'm a person who likes a lot what I have, and I'm pretty reluctant to let go of it. And I might posture and say that I'm a 160, that I'm a high valuation. And this person who is the buyer may really want it badly, but he may be tempted to say, look, I don't care very much. This isn't important to me. And that kind of posturing really screws up the possibility that you'll get these divisions that you should get. And I'm not going to go into sort of explaining that. But that's kind of an easy argument. You can just think about the zero posturing and saying he's really a 160. You know, then at least half the time when he's facing a 200, he'll be getting this 180, which is really amazing for this person. So the posturing can have real benefits. Pardon me for doing that somewhat quickly. Now, I'm going to give you a very advanced example. And this example is a situation where a seller who has two goods, and either the first good is valuable or the second good is valuable. And either the first good is worth nothing to him, or the opposite. And you can see the same kind of thing is going on here. So it's a little bit more like the situation where I was negotiating with the dean. Okay? Now, if you're really interested in this stuff, write down this game and think hard about how people might negotiate. And this is a game where you have lots of problems, perhaps, in getting the outcome that you should get, because, in fact, people may posture. You know, the zero might say, look, I don't want to give you this. It's really very valuable to me. But in fact, this is a game where, surprisingly, very clever bargaining, very clever negotiation, where people are looking more at the problem as a whole, can get you to very good outcomes. Now, there's a very bad typo here. That number 12 should be a 10, I notice as I look at it. So the kind of offers, to give you a hint of what goes on, that the seller makes is the seller knows that he has high valuation for the first, low for the second, but he doesn't know which of these people he's facing. If it's an 8-0 facing a 2-10, and if they're going to split things equally, then they should trade only the second good. And if they split the surplus, they would trade it at 5. On the other hand, if the seller is dealing with this person, then he should trade both, because on both of these, there's gain. 8 to 10 gives a gain of 2. 0 to 2 gives a gain of 2. So a very clever kind of offer that the seller could make is say, look, I'm going to give you the following offers. I will let you take the second good at price 5. I keep the first good. Or I will give you both of them at price 10. And you choose. I don't know which you are. If you've had a lot of economics, this is called screening. You can make an offer which screens which one of these you get. Okay? And what I invite you to do is think hard about a situation where It's a seller who half the time, first good, second good, half the time, first good, second good. I'm using two goods here. I didn't introduce that very well. Half the time, second good, first good, second good, half the time, first good, second good valuations. And think about these kinds of offers. Now, the talk that I'm introducing you to does the following. And there are many books which talk about this more complex form of bargaining, which we call negotiation. And these books use words like this. People want different things. So when I make my offer, it's not like the situation, we know you both wanted money, right? But here, I don't know how the second person thinks about the first good or the second good. It can be this way or it can be this way. And the same way on the other side, okay? So people want different things. That's what happens. I don't know whether my dean candidate really cares about money for the house or really cares that I give a big dowry. And she doesn't know which one of these is really expensive for me. Invent options for mutual gain. Look ways that we can both do better. That's what the kind of offer that I was just explaining does. Get past the idea there's a fixed sum. You know, here, if in fact it was this meeting this, then there's a possible gain of 10, right, by trading the second commodity. If it's this meeting this, there's a gain of only 4, because the gain in the first is 2, the gain in the second is 2. So get past the idea that there's a fixed sum. Think about ways to satisfy the other in a way that's good for you. That's what the kind of offer that I was explaining does. Think about what you'd like to walk out of the meeting with, always a good question, good idea. Put multiple items on the table. So we were just doing something which was a little more complicated than just bargaining over one item. There were a couple of things that we should be talking about. We should talk about them simultaneously. Broaden your options and the options available to the other party. I didn't say you can only do this. I said take a choice of this one or that one. Okay? That's good bargaining advice. Game theory tries to tell stories where you bring out this kind of idea. And so the paper that you'll hear tomorrow, which is really a research paper again, really tries to unpack this, doesn't do it completely well, doesn't solve Fujitsu IBM, but tells stories that hopefully make one think that they understand that that kind of thing a little bit better. Okay, I think I'm about 3 minutes over. I'm going to allow time for questions. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cost per day in incomplete contract.
Yep.
Have some previous interaction that got you to the bargaining position.
Yeah.
To what extent one can defy Adam Smith with these ideas when you have this past, say, emotion?
Yeah. So, look, it's a very good question. There are really two things. One is just past relationships per se, and then emotional aspects. You use both words there. So they're both very important. The first thing I would say that in terms of anything that one could hope to do formally, it matters a lot whether you're playing these games repeatedly, okay? Just as it matters a lot in the prisoner's dilemma that if people are playing it repeatedly. So we're trying to tell a story that is very, is trying to emphasize some things that are important in terms of this sort of language and don't even require one to talk about repeated play. In fact, repeated play is very important. In fact, reputations are very important. If you know the other person is always going to play tough, no matter what. In the past, playing with other people has always played tough. That's going to affect the way that you behave. And a lot of that is emotional. I don't want to lose. I'm not going to settle for less than you have. Okay? Now, and then there are even matters of irrationality. I'm sorry. And then there are even matters of irrationality. So, the art in all of this is trying to pick on the right parts of the stories that you can really say something that's a bit sharp. Now, here I'm just giving examples, but in fact, the research that we do is theory. It gives pretty general coverage, but it doesn't cover things like reputational things, histories, and emotional response, and social pressure. But, that doesn't mean that it's not valuable. I mean, I would say that the prisoner's dilemma story that I began with is a very, very valuable story. Every undergraduate should understand the prisoner's dilemma. One of the things that I didn't say at the very beginning of my introduction is, this business of what you leave to government and what you think the invisible hand will do well. It's a very tricky business. We were speaking before the talk began about educational system. I'm sitting with an expert here. To what extent do you want an educational system which is really just the result of an invisible hand? It's just people get what they pay for and can afford, or is education something that you want to provide publicly? Maybe it matters what level. Some people would say that at very elementary level, you just can't afford not to have a country, a state, which isn't providing good education for its citizens. It's like, but people will disagree on this, just as they will disagree on medical procedures and drugs. We have in the United States a pretty arduous system to get drugs approved, okay? Forget about how they're paid for. To get them approved, to license who can give out various forms of drugs, maybe there should be an invisible hand, Personally, I don't think so, I should tell you. But, you can have differences, and the differences are affected by how you feel about your government, the competence of your government, the honesty and integrity of your government. There are social capital aspects of this. There's not one size fits all for all societies. But every society has to grapple with this. Sorry, that was too long an answer.
Any question?
Mucho gusto. Oh, yes, there's another question. A recidivist. Yeah.
You're citing Getting to Yes, which, if I'm not wrong, was a bestseller. You could buy it in the supermarket.
Yeah.
And it's already 18 years old. So this is still a book we should read or read again.
Yes, A Beautiful Mind. You should read it as an element of biography, of history. The economics that it will teach you is pretty minimal. The big story that it tells at the beginning is a horrible sexist story that I wouldn't want to associate myself with, of John Nash walking around at a party, gets a lot of play at a movie and picking out a date or something like that. But it's, it raises some of the issues, but it's a story about a beautiful mind and an amazing human being. when John Nash died, he fell out of a taxi. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He had just come back from winning one of the major prizes in mathematics in Europe. And he was making the last part of the trip back to Princeton. He fell out of a taxi. I mean, life is very, is precious and a little bit random. And you know, that's not in the story, but it's a good movie. The book is better in terms of sort of giving you a little bit of feeling of the intellectual life.
But you endorse getting good, yes.
Oh, no, that book, I'm sorry. No. This book is quite a nice book. I mean, in a sense, this is a great book on people who want to be better negotiators, okay? And in a sense, what we're trying to do is build, you know, more solid foundations for a theory. So it looks a little bit like not just Prisoner's Dilemma, but all kinds of Prisoner's Dilemma at once. And it incorporates these kinds of things. So the truth is, we started doing this research before I read those books. I have a life where I've been involved in quite a lot of negotiations because of other things that I've done. And I think that's a wise book. You know, I think for most people, I would say read this, don't study game theory, okay? It's more of a common man kind of thing. But it's, you know, we do different things, and really understanding things, the way that you really understand them when, for example, you see how Meyerson explains why differences in information necessarily lead to social loss. This result you get in Rubinstein is not true when you have worlds where there's asymmetric information, where you have uncertainty about how the person across the table values different parts. Okay. Incomplete contracts is an important, you know, idea in and of itself, but is somewhat different than what I'm talking about here. What this says, what Meyerson Satterthwaite says, in a sense, is that the kind of contracts you can write are very limited. It's not that a priori you say there are incomplete contracts. It's just that when people get together to bargain and you have asymmetric information, it prevents sometimes fundamental problems in getting to good outcomes. And that's really something to take away. This idea that the invisible hand always does it, what doesn't do very well when you have asymmetric information. In fact, the paper that we're writing, the papers that we're writing, show both in experiments and in theory that in fact the invisible hand does a little bit better than one might think. So it's a kind of positive in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Julio,
Mucho gusto.
let us chat 1 second more. We have a little present, you know.
Oh, oh.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is
Oh,
the present.
oh my goodness.
Okay.
Wow.
This is Romero Carranza.
Romero, oh my goodness. So I'm a horse owner at one point in my life.
Okay.
I was very excited to do it. Well, I hope you can come up and shake my hand. Better, you can come up and look at this. It's very handsome. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
This work?
Yeah, it was. So I will take care of this. We will pack it. I will send it to pack, and then on Saturday we see. Okay. In case that you prefer, because you don't want to travel so heavy, I can take it to you in the summer.
I think we'd love to have it right away. And
Okay.
I'll ask Beth. but
Okay,
I don't think
so
it's-
you guys have, in any case, I can take it in, okay? And also, yeah, Okay, okay, so great, and well, we have the presentation. Yeah. So now we go for lunch,
lunch,
for the bus, okay?
Bueno,
I show you.
good.
Claro, mañana hay un seminario a las 12:30 del profesor de Australia, sí, que es el coautor de... Sí, sí, sí. Entonces, acordate de llevar, que lo tenga Nancy.
Sí.
Lo que deberíamos hacer es mandárselo de vuelta. Eso dejar una
Sí, aparte llamada operativa por ahí, capaz que con Mónica, que bien, pero yo se lo digo a Nancy que guarde bien. Que el certificado me decís vos lo que das vos o lo comés. No sé cómo sale esto, porque no sé cómo era el mecanismo, si vos lo te lo mandan por correo, si no tienes cómo tienen que declararlo.
No, eso se lo llevarían ellos.
Entonces eso lo dejo a Nancy, que después ya vos arreglás con ella cómo se lo...
Perfecto,
cómo se hace.
eso sí.